Hey there, and welcome to a very special episode, a pop-up episode of Practically Political with my co-host Dave Spencer. And we are excited because we have a very special guest. Her name is Michelle Nellenbach. She's a vice president at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the BPC. And BPC does some important work, and Michelle's going to tell us more about it. And I think it's doing some very important work at a crucial time in our country's history. I mean, we here at Practically Political, we want to be pragmatic. We want to find areas of agreement. Dave and I often disagree on a lot, but I think there are very important key points where we are able to find agreement. And Michelle, I'd love for you to tell us first just a little bit about Bipartisan Policy Center and the history, but then also where are you guys today?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm really excited to join you and look forward to the conversation. So the Bipartisan Policy Center is a think tank. We are based in Washington, D.C., founded about 15 years ago by four former Senate majority leaders, Howard Baker, Bob Dole, George Mitchell, and Tom Daschle. And they had come together basically around an energy project. And from that point, we have now grown to an organization of about 140 staff, and we cover issues ranging from the debt, federal debt, the deficit, energy, healthcare. I oversee our technology, housing, infrastructure, corporate governance work. So we really run the gamut of public policy issues. And our basic mission is to bring together proud partisans. So not the squishy middle, but folks who really have deeply held beliefs, as the four former majority leaders certainly did, to come together to find some common ground around some of these really tough, hot button issues. I, for instance, have come from Capitol Hill, where I spent 13 years working for various Republicans. And one of the reasons I love where I am is I am asked to bring that perspective into the room and have those conversations and speak not on behalf of, but as a conservative and a Republican.
And so what about today in terms of, because there's the history, where is BPC today? There's been so many tectonic shifts, starting from a certain man going down a golden elevator in 2015. How did Bipartisan Policy Center navigate all of those shifts and this idea of establishment versus the swamp?
Well, it's really interesting because as you listen to much of the media, present company excluded, you would think that bipartisanship is dead and that the only thing that happens in Washington are partisan battles. And that is certainly around really tough issues around abortion and crime. But there is a lot of really good work being done behind the scenes. And that's kind of where we excel. Our phone doesn't stop ringing. We have numerous requests from members on the Hill from both parties wanting to work with us, wanting our help working with their colleagues, finding issues that they can cross the aisle on. But at the end of the day, there really is a lot of substantive work going on the Hill. And we're really front and center in a lot of those conversations. And it's actually a really good place to be right now. In terms of the battle for the heart of the Republican Party, if you will, between the establishment and we'll just say the MAGA crowd, the more right side of the party, we do the best we can to reflect both those viewpoints and bring them to the fore. And it has been a little bit of a challenge as a Republican to figure out where exactly the party is, so that when we have these negotiations, we can accurately reflect that. But we simply changed a little bit, and now we make sure that we have both sides of the Republican Party, the same as there are multiple viewpoints within the Democratic Party nowadays. So trying to reflect all of that. So we're bipartisan, but you're almost looking at multiple lanes within each party that we do our best to reflect.
Well, Michelle, what are some of the projects that you have worked on of which you are most proud? And if there's one thing that you really would want to do, but you're having trouble doing, but you think maybe there's a chance it can be done, what do you think that is? I'd love to hear about some of your past and present battles, so to speak, and challenges.
Well, one of the things that I particularly have loved working at BPC, I've been there about 12 years, and I'm usually called upon to start new work streams. So when somebody comes to us with an idea, or our president has an idea and they're like, we need someone to bring this to fruition, find funders, find staff, work on policy, they have typically turned to me to do. So I've started a number of initiatives. Some have succeeded, some have not. The one that one of the ones I'm most proud of is actually something we had done with former Congressman Will Hurd from Texas. He, as you'll know, had a history in the CIA. He was retiring from congressional service and was very concerned that the federal government was not prepared to rise to the challenges presented by artificial intelligence and our use of data. And so he came to BPC and asked us to help him create a national strategy. He brought with him Congresswoman Robin Kelly from Illinois. And so together with BPC over the course of only 8 months, numerous meetings, we issued 4 reports with about 80 recommendations on how Congress and the federal agencies could deal with artificial intelligence. And so that became a resolution that was introduced by Congresswoman Kelly and Congressman Hurd. It was a sense of the House, so it passed the House. And it does help guide how they decide to fund artificial intelligence research and other projects. And so I'm really proud of that work, in part because we did it was just me and one of my colleagues on a shoestring budget, and working with 2 incredible members of Congress across the aisle. We brought together civil society and industry and academia and really came up with a proposal that I think has helped, in a positive way, helped Congress and the agencies do their job. So that's just one example of the kind of thing we do at the BPC. I've done a lot around infrastructure. We have a very big new housing project funded by a gentleman named Ron Twilliger, who is in the housing business. And we're looking at housing supply and homelessness and how we can help make homes more affordable. There's a huge shortage right now, so we're looking at supply issues. And so we have a monthly event series on that. And so there's a lot of really good, solid policy work going on.
And what do you think is your greatest challenge?
Well, some of it's the perception that bipartisanship isn't really possible, which I wouldn't have spent 12 years here if I didn't think it wasn't, if I agreed with that. And honestly, from a personal perspective, I think some of it is engaging with the more conservative side of the Republican Party. Typically, Republicans have been skeptical. The sort of bipartisan efforts as viewed as they just want to make Republicans into moderates, or really they just want Republicans to embrace democratic ideas. That is not how we approach anything. And so it's building up that trust within Republicans that they can come to the BPC, they can work with us, that we're respectful of their viewpoints and really do want to try and find that place where they can agree with the Democrats and we can come out with a solution that's better for the American people and the country. And we've demonstrated that over and over again. Former Senate Majority Leader Lott is part of our energy project and our congressional reform project. We've had Eric Cantor was part of the BPC. We've got Bill Schuster, who's a former member of Congress. We have a number of really outstanding Republicans part of the organization. And so part of my challenge is really trying to spread that word within conservative and Republican circles that bipartisanship and compromise are not bad words, that they are really the way the country moves forward.
You know, it's interesting you say that as far as getting the difficulty getting conservatives on board, because as you're talking, you reminded me of a quote that George Will gave. I think he was speaking to my alma mater at Brigham Young, if I'm not mistaken, during a speech. And he said, so often when you're talking about bipartisanship, I'm paraphrasing here, but you're essentially always going to be growing the size of government if it's a bipartisan compromise. You know, if you want it to be $100 billion and Republicans want zero, meeting halfway means you're always losing because you're always going to be growing the size of government. Does BPC ever think about things like regulatory reform? I know for the Trump administration, they had a rule where for every new regulation, they had to repeal 2 regulations. Because when you stack up all the the regulations, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a libertarian think tank where I was a fellow, every year they put out like they call it their 10,000 commandments, and they estimate the cost of regulation on the economy and things like occupational licensing, things that make it bureaucratic for you. Does BPC think about things that way?
Oh, yes. And I'll just say that's a really good point that he makes. And that is actually one of our challenges, is if you are a think tank focused on federal policy, as a conservative and a Republican, you don't necessarily think the government isn't your solution. And so what do we want to put forward as Republicans? And a lot of that comes down to streamlining processes, making it easier to get permits. We have done a lot of work around regulatory reform. First, we had a project looking at how to get more P3s. So you're reducing the federal investment because you're bringing in more private capital into those infrastructure projects. A huge hurdle in that is the American regulatory system. It simply takes way too long to get projects permitted and constructed in this country. And the costs exceed that of anywhere else in the world. Like, it just costs too much money to do business here. And so we put forth a lot of recommendations on how to streamline the processes. And then we also then convened another working group that included Senator Rick Santorum and a couple of Democrats and a few other Republicans to come out with some more solid recommendations around permitting reform, NEPA. And so those recommendations have served the basis of a couple bills that have been introduced. We're working really closely with Hill now. We worked a lot on the infrastructure bill that just recently passed, trying to figure out how to streamline those federal processes. It's also a big part of our housing work, and I can only speak from the few projects that I work on. But one of the major issues for regulatory for building more affordable homes is actually regulation and state and local land use restrictions. And so we are working on how we can help as a federal think tank. Is it incentives? What can we do to help state and local governments reduce those strings so that we can build more affordable housing quicker, because people are desperate and in need of it. So that's a really big part of a number of our projects. And how do you reduce costs, and how do you reduce the burden?
Well, and frankly, where I live in California, yes, there are a few people that are leaving because of taxes, but California's tax system is actually, while high, is pretty progressive. It's mainly, lack of or living expenses, i.e. lack of affordable housing. And the number one criterion that causes these problems is a lot of cities that refuse to zone multi-unit housing, right? So a place like Palo Alto, it's all single family homes. And you look at the average price in California, who can afford that? So it's this classic, this NIMBYism makes it really, really hard.
It's a really good point, and it's a very difficult issue, is that so much of the country is zoned for single family homes. And that is just not a good model going forward if we are going to find both the quantity of homes we need, but also affordable homes. We are really pricing way too many families out of areas that are near jobs, most importantly. They need to be able to live near where they work, and we simply do not have the housing available for that.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see to the extent to which, well, I'm just thinking in New York, for example, I actually used to I was renting an apartment literally on Wall Street. The building was 45 wall, and it used to be a bank. So there used to be a vault the vault was long gone, but the actual unit I lived in was, part of the banking system, or I don't know exactly what the setup was, but do you think we'll see maybe a lot of commercial real estate? Because so much of this, the pandemic disrupted the idea of commuting and telecommuting, and a lot of people want to work from home. Do you think we might see repurposing and rezoning of maybe some of these commercial buildings and converting them into multifamily housing?
There is actually a push to do that, because like you said, and particularly I'm living in DC, I might get the percentage wrong, but there's something like 40% of office buildings are vacant or have huge vacancies. So because people are not going back to the office, and so they're just sitting there, and landlords are losing money. And so there is a push to see if we can't rezone some of that to make it for affordable homes. And you could put multiple apartments in some of those office suites. So obviously you'd have to make sure there are services and they're accessible, et cetera. But I think that is potentially one solution to two problems. We have an affordable housing problem, but you also have some of the downtowns of cities are dying because workers simply did not go back to work.
What is the one thing in 2023 that you've been hoping to accomplish, but you haven't as of yet, that you would love to see? Something that so far has escaped bipartisan grasp, shall we say?
Wow, that's a tall order. So some of the things that my team and I are focused on in the next year is one, the competitiveness issue, how we are competing with China. I think it's an area ripe for bipartisanship. The House created a select committee on China that was like a 365 to 65 vote. It is strongly bipartisan. Members across the country are concerned that we are losing our edge internationally. And so that's one that BPC is diving into and trying to see where we can help, what kind of policies we need to put in place to shore up American industry, to make us more competitive. And some of that goes to the regulatory conversation that we'd had just a few minutes ago. The other one that we have been doing a lot on is this issue around ESG and corporate governance. For those who don't know, that's environmental, social, and governance issues around corporations. And this push by some on the left to have corporations go what many would argue is beyond their purpose in addressing societal ills. And then you have a push on the right to push back on some of that. But then you also have some Republicans who, for instance, Ron DeSantis and Disney, whether you agree with what he did or not, he's using government to impact corporations in much the same way the left is talking about. So they're complicated. They're very complicated issues. And I think both sides are using a lot of politics around it. And so we're trying to figure out how you can bring the temperature down a little bit. Because if you're an American company or an insurer or a pension fund, you've got some states saying, don't you dare invest in oil and gas. And you have other states saying you had better invest in oil and gas. And so I think they're in a really tough spot. And so we're going to try and help navigate that over the next year or so. Not an easy one.
I would love to see the solutions you have on that, because I am a fellow with the State Financial Officers Foundation, which is a group of state treasurers that is very heavily pushing back on the ESG at the state level. So to be continued on that, I'd love to talk to you more about that, Michelle. I know we're coming to a close on the podcast, but Dave, you wanted to say something?
No, I just was saying it's been wonderful to have you on the show, and I just tell us a little more. How can people go to support your organization or learn more about it? What should we do? Because I think one thing Carrie and I do agree on is there's certainly a need for more bipartisanship. I don't think you get much disagreement on that anywhere in the political world.
Well, that's great. Thank you for the opportunity. So our website is www.bipartisanpolicy.org. We're on all the various social media platforms. So you can go there and find out some more information. Like I said, we have projects in just about every area someone would be interested in. And we have events, virtual events, probably at least one a day, if not two a day. So there's plenty of opportunities to kind of tune in and see what we are up to. And I would say, like, it sounds a little Pollyannish, and I recognize that. And it's hard because the media doesn't often report on it. But when there are bipartisan successes, people really should reach out to their members and thank them for that versus just calling them to complain when things don't get done. They need a little positive reinforcement sometimes.
Excellent. Okay.
I agree.
Thanks so
we need
much.
to put more positivity
Thanks
in the world.
Thanks for coming on the show, Michelle, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was great.